Hello, hi everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us today. We welcome our special speakers for today, both experts in their field. We have Michele, I hope I will pronounce it properly, Heimbauer. Is it something like that? And Dr. Amber DeBono, that's easy to pronounce. Today they will be joining us. They will be sharing their expertise with us about well-being and dyslexia. I'll hand over to Amber and Michele. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Michele Heimbauer, and with me is Dr. Amber DeBono. Thank you for joining us today to talk about well-being and dyslexia, fostering self-regulation skills. At the heart of Winston Preparatory Schools, which is a worldwide multi-campus independent school for students with learning disabilities, is what we call the Innovation Lab, which is not actually a place, but it's every classroom, every space of our campuses where teachers and leaders work together to link research to practice. Like I said, I am Michele Heimbauer, the Associate Director of the Innovation Lab, where my main role is to develop and interpret our in-house research, integrating that with research that's out in the field, and discuss how best to apply this research with our campus teachers and leaders, while also looking at what is working best for our students, how we can better define learning disabilities, as well as sharing our findings with the public. Dr. Amber DeBono is also here with us today, like I said. Amber is the Innovation Lab's Director of Research, and she leads all of our original research, particularly in relation to dyslexia and self-regulation. We're really excited to be here today to talk to you about some of our social emotional research. And I think on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our projects and how we got involved in all this. I'm just gonna admit there's some people waiting, so I'm gonna add them. Okay. So for a bit of background, when the Innovation Lab was first developed over a decade ago, one of our first initiatives was a project called Fostering Wellness. As a school for students with learning disabilities, we were always interested in promoting a positive and safe school environment so that students felt supported, understood, and safe to take academic risks so they could progress. We knew that a significant piece of the learning and remediation process for our students relied on building their social emotional skills. And there was research supporting this notion, but it was scarce, especially for students with learning disabilities. So that's where we dove in. The Innovation Lab is continuously surveying and applying current research on any topic that will support our students so that we're always on the cutting edge of both academic and social emotional best practices, which, as it turns out, overlaps more than most people realize. So we began with the goal of identifying what specific skills make the most impact on our students and what skills lead to independence, which led us to our two major research projects, which I'll let Amber explain.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you all today. So the first project, we have these two main projects. First is the Winston Essential Skills Survey, which is a teacher response assessment of social and emotional learning skills that was designed especially for kids that have learning disabilities. We designed the survey and we've recently published our findings showing that it's reliable and valid. So it's a good survey to use in your classrooms to assess your kids that have learning disabilities in regard to their social and emotional skills. At Winston, we focus on what is called the qualities of a sustainable and independent learner. That is what is assessed by the Winston Essential Skills Survey. We're going to be talking about those qualities multiple times through our presentation, but they're essentially 8 types of social and emotional learning skills that we teach in the Winston classroom, and we assess it yearly. So we collect a lot of data on our students, and that's just some of the data that we collect. We also have a longitudinal study. It's called the Lives Over Time study, where we follow our students from their senior year at Winston, and we follow them for the rest of their lives, particularly in terms of how they're doing academically, with their employment, and with their personal successes. And we're trying to figure out what Winston is doing that's causing these really impressive outcomes that Winston alumni tend to have. And we're publishing those findings as well. So that's just a little glimpse into the 2 major projects of the Innovation Lab.
Thank you, Amber. So researchers are interested in what skills matter, especially related to the job market and adult success and independence. So we have a quick poll for you. When senior executives from big companies such as Google, Microsoft, and Southwest Airlines were asked how they would rate the importance of social emotional skills versus technical skills, what do you think they said? So I put that poll up there. You should be able to see it and respond. We've got some responses trickling in. Okay. So it looks like, yep, the majority of you got it right. They all shared that they find social emotional skills are just as valuable a skill set as technical skills. Without the ability to work with others effectively, problem solve, communicate, remain goal-oriented, regulate their emotions and their actions, their technical skills would be of little value. Okay, shut that off. You go to the next. So as Amber mentioned, a lot of our research is looking into what specific social emotional skills, especially our students with learning disabilities, need to become independent and successful adults. So she's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So these are the qualities of a sustainable and independent learner, the 8 social and emotional learning skills that are taught in the Winston classroom that we assess yearly by the Winston Essential Skills Survey. And these seem to be very critical for success in students. There's plenty of evidence to show that is the case. And just to give you a brief review of these 8 skills, resilience is the ability to recover from and adjust from fortunes or unfortunate circumstances. Social skills has to do with strengthening personal relationships. Self-advocacy has to do with asking for assistance, and that can include things like requesting accommodations, which is often needed, especially at the college level. Social responsibility has to do with being an effective and helpful member of their communities. Self-regulation has to do with being goal-directed across time, even if they're frustrated or distracted. Self-reflection has to do with being reflective and being self-aware. Problem solving means being an adaptive and creative problem solver and trying different solutions to solve a problem. And management and organization has to do with prioritizing, organizing, and completing tasks effectively. So those are the 8 social and emotional learning skills that we assess every year and is measured by the Winston Essential Skills Survey. All right. So you may be wondering why social and emotional learning, or SEL for short, is important for our children. And so there is plenty of evidence to show that it's important to our children. For example, there's been research that shows that after participating in SEL programs, students continue to show progress in several key areas, particularly in academic achievement. So if our students have social and emotional learning skills, particularly our kids with learning disabilities, they're going to do better in school. They're going to get better grades, things like that, better test scores. There's also evidence to show that it improves the students' well-being overall, and they tend to be more positively engaged in school. And these the results from these SEL programs, the outcomes don't just last a couple weeks or even a couple months. There's evidence that shows that these improvements can last for up to 18 years. And we show that, and the research shows that this occurs across races, social and economic status, and even across locations. No matter where these studies happen around the world, they show these positive effects from implementing social and emotional learning into the classroom. And this is our research. So this was published in Learning Disabilities, a multidisciplinary journal. And this is the results of our Lives Over Time study in particular. And what we found is that when teachers and families are supportive with their students, results in improvements in social and emotional learning skills, self-advocacy, self-determination, and social connections. And those SEL skills then predicted more positive life satisfaction, actually multiple positive satisfaction outcomes. And so this is just a glimpse into what we're doing at our campus to show that social and emotional learning skills are critical for later success in life. And here's some more data to show what Winston is doing well and how it's different from the general US school systems. So if you look at the gray bars for reading, you can show that from 2019 to 2022, a very critical period that we all experienced worldwide. So this was when we were in crisis mode. The US scores went down for both reading and for math. Those are the gray bars. But what we found at Winston is that our scores did not go down during this time. In fact, during this critical time, during the pandemic, our scores actually increased, which is very contrary to what we found around the world, but particularly in the US. And so our reading comprehension scores, for example, increased. That's the light blue bar, and word reading increased, as well as numerical operations. So those are some of the types of academic achievement we assess yearly at Winston, and we were able to show that they were actually increasing from 2019 to 2022. So the reason why we think this is happening and what we have evidence for is showing that social and emotional learning is explaining why these increases happened during the pandemic. So that means that social and emotional learning can be a really critical tool for teachers and families to use so that kids can do well during all times, but particularly in these crisis times, such as pandemics.
So I hope that gave you kind of a nice background and overview of the research that we do and our roles at Winston Preparatory School. So today's intentions, though, we want to just go over briefly to be kind of goal-oriented, as we're going to discuss today. So we would hope that you walk away with an understanding of self-regulation skills, how we think about it, a little bit more maybe broadly than maybe others. Why learners, specifically with dyslexia, might struggle particularly with self-regulation, and then how to support your child in the development of these skills. And then based on a few of the questions we received, I'm going to make the assumption that some of you have children or work with students who don't specifically have dyslexia, but want to learn more about self-regulation and how to support your child in the development of these skills. So we plan to touch specifically on why students with dyslexia can struggle with self-regulation, but we'll also widen the lens a little bit so that our discussion can apply more broadly. Okay, Amber. Next slide. So we're going to start with defining self-regulation. When we think about self-regulation, we're thinking about a person being able to remain goal-directed across time, even in the face of difficult situations and difficult emotions, such as boredom, annoyance, frustration, and they display impulse control in their decisions to either start or stop an action. Self-regulation is a challenge for every child and adolescent, and even some young adults, and we'll talk about the developmental stages a little bit later. But it's even more complicated for students with learning disabilities, as it relies on a certain level of competency with regard to executive functioning processes, as well as other cognitive processes. So self-regulation, as thinking about it as remaining goal-oriented and goal-directed, both academically and social-emotionally. So it's important to remember that it isn't just reining in impulsive outward behaviors, but also remaining goal-directed when bored or frustrated or uninterested in the topic or the task at hand. And that goes for in school, talking about academic areas, or it also goes for social scenarios, social situations, or at home. We also want to remember that, as with all of the social emotional skills that Amber had gone over, those qualities of a sustainable and independent learner, those skills are skills to employ as you need them, rather than simply traits that you possess or don't. You're not born with them. You need to develop those skills and learn from experiences and strengthen them as you age. And also remember, they're not all or nothing. Self-regulation, just like any of the other social emotional skills, we can have strengths applying self-regulation in certain areas, but maybe less so in other areas. So for example, on the soccer field, my 8-year-old is very self-regulated, very goal-directed, doesn't let anything distract her from getting that ball to her teammates, defending the goal. But sitting in class, that's another story, and that's what we're working on, completely developmentally appropriate. But you can see, even if you think about your own self-regulation skills, there are certain areas of life where it's just easier to self-regulate than in others, and we all have those challenges. Okay. So it's easier, definitely, to self-regulate when we are comfortable and adequately supported. When we feel safe, Amber, you can click through. When we feel safe, when the situation is predictable, when we are clear on the directions or expectations of a task or situation, when we feel competent and confident that we have the skills to successfully complete or engage in the task or the situation. So again, academic or social. When we have experienced success in the past and expect to succeed, when the people around us or the task at hand are familiar, we feel connected to the purpose or the goal or the people around us. That makes it definitely more comfortable, easier to self-regulate. And our general health, eating habits, activity levels, sleep routines also support our overall comfort and self-regulation. When things are unfamiliar, when we are unsure of what's expected of the situation or of us, when we feel rejected or disconnected from the goal or the purpose or from the people around us, when we feel uncertain or know that we lack confidence or competence, it could be very difficult to self-regulate our emotions and responses. All right. So thinking about all that, a student with dyslexia often tends to demonstrate low frustration tolerance and self-esteem, impacting self-regulation. So when we think about dyslexia, we define it as having difficulty learning to read, right? The basics of literacy. Underneath all that, the breakdowns are in these 3 areas. Phonological awareness, which is the ability to recognize and work with sounds in spoken language. Rapid automatic naming, which is the ability to quickly name a series of familiar items like letters or numbers. And then working memory, and that's the ability to hold on to information while you manipulate it. So you're doing something with it. So imagine at the start of formal schooling, so preschool, kindergarten, you struggle to do what your peers are easily doing. And that has to do with the phonological awareness and the rapid automatic naming and the working memory. They are rhyming. They are playing word games. They are identifying letters and quickly naming them. They're writing their names. They're learning to read basic words. The impact of these repeated experiences chips away at one's self-worth if they don't have the competency to quickly and easily learn those skills. So as peers and time progress, frustration can build and the expectation of failure versus success can take over. Sometimes we see unhealthy coping strategies and response patterns can develop, and managing these strong emotions can become increasingly challenging. So like I said, go back, sorry. These early academic challenges can really exacerbate those feelings of incompetence. Working memory specifically is really important for executive functioning process development. And that is the EF, executive functioning process and skill development is key to developing that self-regulation. Working memory helps us learn how to control our attention, resist distractions, which is essential for focusing on tasks and resisting impulses. Working memory maintains our awareness of our goals and making decisions that align with them. So it helps us keep those goals in mind while we're doing something else. So, and even faced with temptations or challenges, we can kind of filter those out or bring ourselves back to that goal that we're working towards. And again, academic or social. Working memory also allows us to regulate our emotions and express our emotions more effectively. And it supports our ability to control our thinking. So allowing us to sidestep habitual behaviors and be able to shift and change to focus more on goal-directed behaviors. So a student with dyslexia, what we typically see is that they are demonstrating frustration meeting their own or others' expectations. This can impact social relationships. It can cause anger or withdrawal. And they start to learn how to expect failure instead of success. So that working memory piece, along with the competency of basic reading skills, really impacts their ability to develop those self-regulation skills. The positive for our students with dyslexia, they typically have strengths in reasoning, which supports their reflection skills and their ability to learn specific strategies to help that self-regulation development. And I know somebody asked a question about boys versus girls. So I just want to touch on that. There have been some reports that girls tend to withdraw more and internally struggle with self-regulation, and boys are more external in their challenges with self-regulation. But there really isn't strong evidence that this is truly the case. And anecdotally, we see on our campuses that it's regardless of gender, it doesn't come across the same gender-wise. It's really individual differences, cognitive learning profile differences, prior experience differences, genetic differences, epigenetic differences. There are a lot of different factors that go into how students respond and how they develop and demonstrate strong or weak self-regulation skills. And for all students, regardless of whether they have a learning disability or not, certain triggering situations can elicit a stress response, undermining the brain's ability to self-regulate and remain resilient. So this can be a challenge for any child, adolescent, and young adult, as well as adults. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So before we dive into kind of the what to do part of this discussion, I want to ask you to put in the chat, take a moment to pause and really think about what's hard for you to when is it hard to self-regulate for yourself? I'm going to start by adding, I know, when I'm tired, I have a hard time. Oh, hold on. Let's go to the waiting room. That's not going to help. There we go. Okay, when I'm tired, when I'm mentally drained, when I've had a long day, when it's too noisy, I have a little bit of trouble, and I know that I have to rely on some of my strategies. When my space is a mess, when things are cluttered, there's too much stuff around, meant the kind of visual noise. When I have a lot of things on my mind. Feel a lot of pressure. Yep. When my own child is struggling, sometimes it's hard, especially when I'm tired. I've had a long day. You know, it's, I think a lot of us struggle with that, especially when it is ongoing, and when you're not expecting them to have trouble self-regulating in that moment, so it's unexpected. Having the patience and having the mindset to be able to shift to focus on yourself for a second. That's the whole, you know, getting your own oxygen mask on and working before you can support your children. When your feelings are being ignored, yep. When it's a new environment, for sure. And I keep adding things to my to do my list. When I'm not feeling well. Yeah, these are great. So the point of this exercise is really just to reflect on, you know, even as adults, there are situations where we know we're gonna struggle. The difference is we have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. We have those executive functioning skills. We have the working memory. We have self-regulation skills and coping strategies. You might not be conscious of them, but you probably employ them. So if you know you're tired, you might redesign your meetings, reschedule your meetings for the day. You might realize that you need a walk or need to take a couple of breaths. So it's important to think about and reflect on your own self-regulation skills. What works for you? What gets in the way? What are those challenging situations? So that you can provide good modeling for your child. And it also helps us be more empathetic in those moments. I think I had mentioned it before, but I think it bears repeating. Self-regulation really is not about consistently staying goal-directed. It's okay to derail. It's okay to be sitting in a meeting, be sitting in a presentation, and have other things on your mind, and kind of zone out or get distracted. The self-regulation skill is being able to self-monitor that, to recognize that you are off track and that you pull yourself back on track. So that self-monitoring and shifting back to what you're supposed to be focusing on and what your goal is in the moment, that's the self-regulation part. So we all derail at one point or another. It's getting back on track. So parents can model and verbalize appropriate responses when they're bored or irritated or stressed. You know, we all have those moments. And building your awareness of your triggers, how you cope, how you soothe yourself, how you regroup, you know, understanding how you regulate your own emotions helps you become a better model, and it makes it easier to verbalize that. You know, you want to think about how you prepare too, so that you're more able to communicate effectively. So, for example, when your feelings get hurt and you want to say something in anger, but you want to preserve your relationship, what do you do in that moment? What helps you self-regulate? What helps you take a pause and, you know, calm down a little bit? So thinking about those strategies that help you, and then verbalizing it to your child. So, you know, at dinner, you know, I had a really tough moment at work today when I was given, you know, critical feedback on something I did. And my first response was to get angry and feel unappreciated. But then I paused and I took a breath. And I realized it wasn't as critical as I initially thought it was. So that breath really helped me kind of pause and get out of my emotional part of my brain and get back to my logical part, so that I could really think about it more effectively. And then I could apply that to my later work. So it's important for our children to build an awareness that we all experience these moments, and that developing effective strategies is a process and it takes practice. You know, normalizing that it's okay to get upset, to get angry, to be bored, to lose track of what you're working on. But how do we get back on track? So modeling mindfulness as you prepare for a situation you might have difficulty with, and explaining your process, and how you plan to regulate your attention or keep your emotions balanced when facing a difficult conversation or experience. You know, talking about that with your child. You know, of course, keeping in mind their age and what they can handle at that stage, but talking about how it's a learning experience, and it's a skill that's developed and practiced. Okay, I think you can go to the next slide. Oh, we did that already. Whoops. All right, next slide. So if kids can do well, they'll do well. You know, if they do well, they do well if they can. That's what I'm saying. And that's what we truly believe, and that's what the research shows, that that students, if they're not doing well, if they demonstrate challenging behavior or really having trouble starting something, or procrastinating or having trouble with those emotions, something is getting in the way of their success. And that's what we do at Winston Prep. We really dive into our students' learning profiles, their cognitive, academic, social emotional skills, so that we can figure out what's getting in the way. What do they need from us? What kind of support do they need so that they can develop the skills to manage more appropriately and effectively? So first part of that, though, is really understanding expectations for the different stages. Not so much where they should be at a given age, but rather kind of where they are, just appreciating where they are and what's expected at that age, and then looking forward to what's next. What skills are we going to target? What are we going to work towards? What are our goals for this particular self-regulation development? So it starts as a baby. They start with response inhibition when a baby responds to one adult but not another. That's kind of that stranger danger piece. Working memory is just starting to develop. They can begin storing and retrieving visual information, so that allows them to recognize a familiar face or object. They relate to attachment to certain toys that soothe them or preferred positions. They begin the emotional control piece of it. They can be settled and soothed by certain familiar people. And attention, they can start making and keeping eye contact and tracking objects with their eyes. And then around a year or so, they can be expected to hold that attention on something interesting for about a minute. And then the next stage, usually around 1 to 2 years of age, they're still developing all of those skills, but then they start becoming a little bit more flexible as well. And then 3 and 4 years, 3 and 4, working memory is still continuing to develop. They can start to follow and complete some simple but multi-step tasks, but definitely need a little help. So cleaning their room, getting dressed, following a classroom routine. Again, they can do it, but with help. They are building that sustained attention to a couple of minutes. They're starting to understand goal persistence, and they start with the inhibition of behaviors. So they start understanding and recalling, don't touch the stove, it's hot, or we don't push. So things like that, at 3, 4 years of age, they start understanding that piece of it and start being able to recall it. But again, thinking about that working memory piece, if you have a child who has a weak working memory, that's going to be tough to develop that recall of it while something is happening. Around 5 to 7 years, as they're getting a little older, they're still building that working memory, but they can do things a little bit more independently at this stage. And then the primary school years, so like 8 to 10 years of age, they can start building that sustained attention a little bit more. They're starting that self-regulation a little bit more. Flexibility continues to develop. But each stage is really, you'll notice, is kind of incremental in their working towards independence with these skills. They still need tons of support. Even in the teen years, 11 to 13, that pre-adolescent phase, they can start completing more complex tasks independently, but again, still need support for self-regulation, especially impulse control. But we do start to see some improvements in this area when they are in a structured, routine, rule-bound environment like school. And then ages 14 to 18, so when they're older teens, huge range with this age group. A 14-year-old looks very different than an 18-year-old will. still, though, they have some refining to do. They're still developing these skills. And even though there's some independence there, it's still developing. That brain is still, it's not fully cooked yet. All right, Amber, you can go to the next slide. And then this slide just shows that self-regulation is still developing, even into early adulthood. And that's mainly because their life situation changes. So they have to learn a whole new set of rules. How do I apply these skills that I've practiced throughout my past years to these new scenarios? You know, they have to balance work, social life, maybe college, a job. And then even in their 20s, that adulthood piece of it, learning how to add kind of home responsibilities and family responsibilities. So, and research shows that our prefrontal cortex is still developing, sometimes into our 30s. So again, there's support needed at every stage. The main idea really is at any point in raising or working with a child, as the adult, you should expect to have to co-regulate at one point or another, as children and adolescents just aren't fully developed until, again, their mid-30s. I know it's daunting, but that's what it is to be a parent and to work with students. You know, it's you're their executive functioning until they've fully developed it. Okay, so when we think about self-regulation and how to support it and develop those skills with our children, there are 3 stages. There's the before stage, where we're kind of laying the groundwork and creating supportive and comfortable environments like we talked about before, so that we're setting them up for success as much as we can. But of course, the inevitable happens, and they will need support in regulating those emotions. So what do we do? How do we support during a challenging emotion or situation? And then there's the after as well. So after everything kind of calms down, we're over that hump, that hill. How do we kind of close that circle, close that loop, so that we can learn from that experience and keep developing those skills? So the beforehand is establishing routines, and that could be whether you're in school or at home. What can they expect? Those expectations should be clear, maybe even visual, depending on your kid. But establishing those routines, you know, what we do when we wake up, nighttime routines, mealtime routines. When we get home from school, what's the routine look like? Homework routines. So any recurring events throughout the day should have some sort of routine involved. And then also routines of things like mindful breathing, sleep routines, screen routines, activity routines like getting fresh air, being involved in sports and movement, are also really important. That mindful breathing, I know, I'm sure most of you have heard of how that's an effective strategy to down-regulate or regulate your emotions in the moment. But to get more bang for your buck, that happens in a routine. So if you are doing mindful breathing each day, each morning and each night, or mindful movement each morning and each night, doesn't have to be twice a day. I just came up with that. But that kind of primes your brain and kind of lays the foundation for when things are challenging, you're better equipped to be able to use that breathing exercise, practice, and apply it in the moment. Just like learning any other skill, you have to practice it in isolation when things are calm and structured. And then eventually you learn to apply it independently as needed. So it's the same thing with self-regulation strategies. So those breathing exercises, mindful movements, reflection ideas, grounding exercises, all of those things are much more effective if they're practiced regularly so that they can be applied independently eventually when they're actually needed. Another piece of it is during that modeling, talking about emotions, using vocabulary of emotions so that you're building that vocabulary repertoire and understanding the nuance between, feeling stressed and feeling anxious. Stress is really more about having too much to do. Anxious is more about feeling out of control. So kind of having those conversations and talking about the differences as they come up. And then thoughtful cueing is really, the research really shows the effectiveness of this strategy. And this can happen at school, it can happen at home. So whenever you are about to enter a situation that might be challenging, really just taking a moment to think about what's going to be expected of me in this situation. What are my strengths in this kind of situation? What do I do well with? And where might I struggle? And if if I do struggle, if I do face that challenge, how am I going to cope with that? And so thinking about your strategies and what tools can I use? So that exercise kind of preloads, kind of primes your brain to be aware of what's expected. And then it kind of brings those strategies to the forefront of your mind so that if you do need them, they're more easily accessible. So it's one of our favorite strategies to use in the classroom. And you can easily use it at home too. We're going to a birthday party. I know it's going to be loud. There's going to be lots of kids there. What are you looking forward to for this event? What might you struggle with? It could be, I might get overwhelmed with all the noise. Okay, so if that happens, what are we going to do? Where, we can take a walk. We can go to the bathroom and just wash our hands. So that can be a good strategy. Something to help them feel more in control and aware of what could happen, and then aware of a strategy that has worked for them in the past. And then you can reflect later about how it went and what worked and what didn't. Okay, Amber, next slide. So these are some tools, and we'll include these links in a resource document that we'll share with everybody. But these are great tools to use with kids to develop that emotional vocabulary and awareness. Naming emotions really helps you move from the emotional space to the more logical, linguistic part of the brain, supporting that self-regulation. And it also buys you time. There's a 6-second rule in research where they talk about how it takes about 6 seconds for the chemical involved in the amygdala response to dissipate. So delaying any kind of response for about 6 seconds can prevent the amygdala from kind of hijacking and taking control, causing an overactive emotional response. So naming those emotions not even helps you kind of pause, but also gives you information. You want to approach emotions as information that you're being given. So it treating it like approaching it in a curious way, and really kind of naming that emotion and then learning from it. What is that emotion telling me? What do I need right now in this moment? What can support me going forward? So it gives us information on what we're going through and why we're being challenged in that moment. So these are some great tools. The feeling wheel I have printed and on our fridge for my kids. But you'll notice there's 3 levels. It's a lot of words. And so what I have done is when my youngest was much younger, we only used the center part. I cut out the other 2 rings, and I had the center of the circle displayed. And as she got older and we had more conversations about emotions, we added that second ring. And of course, we're not at that outer ring, she's only 9 or almost 9. But also in movies, when we watch movies, especially Inside Out is an amazing movie. And I think, what's her name? Lisa D'Amour was part of creating those movies. So it really is, those movies are pretty scientifically evidence-based in how adolescent is going through their emotions and what's happening with their emotions. But anyway, that came to mind because, you know, when you're sitting watching a movie, when you're talking about something that happened with friends or something that happened at a family event, or, you know, talking about emotions and how did they feel and how do you think the other person felt and why do you think that? So just using these words in conversation is really helpful in building that vocabulary. Okay. This is also tied to the mood meter. Mark Brackett and folks at Yale recently created this amazing app. It's free for everybody. It's on Apple and Android phones. You can set it up. I wouldn't use it maybe for the younger kids, but for the older kids, definitely. As an adult, I started using it too, just to check in with yourself. But you can set it up so that it pushes notifications. You can have it set for once a day or 4 times a day, or you can have no notifications at all and just check in with yourself when you want to. But it's really helpful to just kind of check in with yourself. Take a moment to think about kind of how you're feeling, why you're feeling it. It also, if you wish, it can track patterns. And it acts as a piece of like a journal as well. So you can have journal entries tied to your emotion. So you can really learn from this app. And it's really incredibly interactive and a learning tool for, I would think, adults as well as adolescents. So this is definitely something I would recommend looking into to use, even just for yourself. Especially with that modeling piece, you really want to work on your own self-regulation skills so that you can be a positive support for your child. Okay. So I know I mentioned co-regulation a few times. There's a great article from Child Mind Institute that we can also include in the resources that talks about co-regulation and what that is. But we love acronyms here and mnemonics. So we talk about co-regulation with leans. So first step is really getting on their level. So when your child or student is really having trouble regulating themselves, getting on their level, trying to meet their eye, so not towering over them as they're, you know, a puddle on the floor, but, you know, sitting down with them. Establishing eye contact if it's appropriate. I know there are some students, especially students who are on the autism spectrum disorder, who eye contact might make them feel uncomfortable. So you might not want that step. But you know your child best. The third step is acknowledge. So enter the conversation with empathy. You know, acknowledge how they're feeling. Name the feeling if you can. And you can, you know, you might not be right, but you could take a guess as to how they're feeling. And then offer a strategy. So something like a mindful breath or things like that, which I think we'll get into in the next slide or two. But offering a strategy, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to do it, especially in the throes of having a hard time. But what can be helpful is, again, that modeling. So you can say, you know, I'm going to do some bubble breaths. You can join me if you want. And then you go and you do them. You do those bubble breaths. And it'll help you stay regulated in the moment, because it's tough as the adult to co-regulate as your child is having a hard time. But you modeling it, eventually they'll be able to do it, especially if you build that those strategies into a routine, a daily routine. Another strategy is, I know I mentioned the breathing a lot. Some kids, that just isn't in the cards. They are not going to take a mindful breath, no matter how you package it. Coin walks or any sort of mindful movement are really helpful for those kids who cannot sit still and have so much energy and really have to kind of hone in on their attention and kind of bring themselves back together. So coin walk is very simple. You take 2 coins, put them on top of your shoes, and then you walk, watching the coins, trying to make them not fall off your shoes. It's the simplest thing, but it helps them attend to something else besides what's happening. So it acts as a grounding exercise. So it's a really simple, great tool. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a great grounding exercise too. Again, when they're in the throes of it, breathing is not always possible. So this is an exercise where it kind of just recenters them in their environment. So 5 things you see, so they name 5 things they see. And if they can't do it, then you do it. 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a great grounding exercise. And again, like I said, they might not be able to, depending on their level. But if you model it and you do it, eventually it'll help them. Okay, next one. These are some other examples that I thought could be helpful in both the classroom and at home. So the stop strategy. So stop, take a breath, observe your body, what's happening in your body, observe what's around you, and then proceed. Take a seat. So observe your sensations, name your emotions, think about your actions, and think about your thoughts. So really just kind of tuning into yourself. The 4 square breathing I love because you could put a green square or any color square on the students, on their Chromebook, on the bottom where the trackpad is, or on a notebook, or on their desk, or anywhere that they need to be. And then they trace it as they're doing the breaths. This is a great breathing routine as well. When you're starting a class, you're starting a particularly challenging task, you do that first. Or you know that there's a challenging situation coming up. So let's do our 4 square breathing before we go into this party with the high energy. And then there's 1, 2, 1. First thought, second thought, first action. That's a great strategy when students or children need to learn how to kind of pause and think before they react. So knowing that their first thought might not always be accurate, kind of like the example that I gave with the critical feedback, how I kind of had to pause, think, and then I reacted. So instead of immediately reacting, we want to encourage them to have their first thought, just recognize it, appreciate it, but then go to a second thought, and then respond rather than just immediately reacting. And that seems to be very helpful for a lot of our students. Oh, there's one more thing I want to say about co-regulation. Sorry. I think it's helpful to think about it as you're being a mentor, you're being a coach. We want to model and teach our children how to be curious about their emotions rather than judge. So again, I had mentioned emotions are information. They tell us that we need something. So approaching those emotions with curiosity helps us figure out what we need. So engaging calmly with empathy and kind of putting that mentor or coach kind of hat on as you are helping co-regulate with your child is really, I think, the key to remember, that you're kind of coaching them through the moment so that they can learn from it. Okay, Amber, sorry. Okay, there were some questions on wanting some strategies on kind of time management, feeling overwhelmed with responsibilities, especially in regard to homework. So I wanted to include a couple of those. So we have own, obligation, aspiration, negotiation. So when thinking about being overwhelmed with homework as well as kind of home responsibilities. And then on top of, when do I get to fit in what I want to do, so thinking about it as obligations, aspirations, negotiations, and then organizing them on a whiteboard, on a piece of paper, on a doc, on your notes, on your calendar, whatever it is. Obligations are things that you have to get done. So homework, obligations can be a chore, obligations can be putting your lunchbox away, putting your stuff in the dishwasher, or putting your sneakers in the closet, or whatever it is. So those are obligations. Aspirations are those things that you want to do. I want to play Zelda. I want to have time to play outside. I want to play Legos. So those are aspirations. And then negotiations. Negotiations are things that you want to get done, would like to get done, but have wiggle room. There's some things that also have to be done, but also have wiggle room. So like you have a library book that you want to read. It's not due for a month, so you have time. So you can negotiate kind of when you're going to do that. Or I want to write a poem for Mother's Day. So I have a deadline, but I've got time. I've got wiggle room. Negotiation can also be like I have a chore to do. Do I have to do it as soon as I get home, or can I do it after I play Zelda for 15 minutes? So negotiating that kind of the when it'll be done. So it will be done. The negotiation part is the when part of it. So thinking about categorizing our responsibilities and our wants in that way is helpful, especially for our older students. When they're younger, we have the strategy of homework, or HW. So it's the have tos and the wants tos. So is this a have to? Do I have to do it? Or is it a want to? I want to do it. And for both of these strategies, it's more about how do I fit in all of these things? So it's not just about I get home from school and all I have to do is obligations, and there's no room for aspirations, or there's no room for the want tos. So finding time and working with our children and how to kind of work on our schedules, and how much time to allocate to each activity is an important learning process. And then if they're having trouble getting started, initiating, that's part of self-regulation. It's not just about stopping a behavior, it's also about initiating. So there's different strategies that we use. Eating the frog, so doing the worst thing first. That's helpful for familiar, boring tasks, like spelling practice or math fact type of things in school, but also at home, like chores, that you kind of have to do it every day. I have to put my dirty laundry in the hamper. Is that the worst thing? Then just do it first, get it done. Spoonful of sugar, that's the little candy treat icon. So sweetening the task by listening to music, or if they have reading to do, sitting in a comfy spot, or sipping on a favorite drink. So this is helpful for kind of routine tasks. Climb the ladder, that's doing the easiest step first. So, and then working to the most challenging step. And this is helpful for the more complex, challenging, or novel tasks. So like writing, math problem solving, our students tend to kind of struggle with. But also, again, this can apply to home. If they have a particularly messy room, where to start. So what is the easiest step first? You know what? Collect all the clothing, put that in the hamper. That's easy because I can see what the difference between clothing and other objects around. So starting there and then moving up to the more challenging step of the process. And then we've got dangling the carrot, which is similar to the Pomodoro technique. I don't know if any of you heard of that, but it's basically setting a timer and rewarding yourself with a movement or a snack break at set intervals. So it's also kind of helpful to kind of get started on things when you're having trouble initiating. So going back to that working memory piece, especially when your child particularly has struggles in this area, regular mindful breathing and movement practice has a general impact on staying or more easily regaining emotional regulation. And then if you're more easily emotionally regulated, then you have more easy access to your working memory stores. But if your child has weakness in the working memory area specifically, there are some evidence-based ways to approach this roadblock, both at home and at school. So attending to details, so coming up with a gesture and a verbal routine to indicate what you're about to say is important, and they should engage and listen. So for example, ears up, so a gesture and the same phrase every time when you want your child to really listen, or hone in, circular motion with a fist at the end to say, you know what, let's attention here. You need to listen to what I'm about to say. Repetition, rehearsal, review. Our children need a ton of repetition. They're learning. They're in the process of learning, and it's hard for many of our students to kind of quickly hold on to the information and then apply it independently. So repetition, rehearsal, review. So rehearsal is really just repeating small amounts of information repeatedly. So this is helpful if it's information that you don't have to put in your long-term memory. So maybe like remembering directions to follow, or kind of what to do next, or you're going to an address, just kind of repeating it over and over is helpful. Elaborate rehearsal strategy is taking the details and making a story about it. So that leads to a deeper association of the details and more of a likelihood that it will be stored in longer term memory. And then there's pause procedure. That's another kind of review strategy where you can pause for a couple of minutes every, say, 15 minutes, give or take, depending on your child. But thinking about what did you just learn? What did we just talk about? Or even, if you're watching a movie, what just happened? How do you think they're feeling? Why do you think they did that? Why do you think they said that? What do you think is going to happen next? So just reviewing that consistently and talking about it not only helps kind of get that information into the kind of short-term memory and maybe long-term memory, but it also kind of helps that comprehension piece of it as well. And then retrieval practice. This is something you can do at dinner. Just, tell me everything you remember about what you learned about at school today. Just bringing information to mind repeatedly without the help of notes or anything like that helps kind of smooth those pathways so that it's easier to recall later. Attaching meaning, that helps a lot of our students too. So teaching them how to connect it to prior knowledge. My dad actually gave me an example. I was talking to him the other day, and they had just moved to a new home community, and they're learning all these people's names. And my dad had met a woman named Elsbeth, and he was like, how am I going to remember? That's such an odd name. But then he remembered he used to watch a show called Elsbeth. I think it's still on. But he associated that person with the show, and so it attached meaning for him. And now he will always remember Elsbeth's names when he sees them. Oh, I think I switched the screen somehow. There we go. Okay. Okay. Attaching meaning, also comparing and contrasting information, especially with emotions, but really any information. This goes for understanding and remembering academic information as well as social emotional information. So how did that make you feel? How was it different than this situation? Just again, approaching it in a curious way. And then, of course, using acronyms and crazy phrases, mnemonics. We do want to be careful, though, that we don't overload our children with crazy phrases or acronyms or mnemonics, because then they kind of lose their meaning if there's too many. So really using them for kind of prioritized information that's connected to their goals. And then chunking information is really helpful too. So that's pulling pieces together. So if you have to remember cowbell farm, you can picture a cowbell, one word instead of two, on a farm. And then so you're not only chunking it, but you're adding that visualization piece that helps. Okay. And then the last step, that bottom of the hill, is the noticing, reflecting, and explicitly praising success. So consistent feedback and praise for handling challenging situations with poise encourages children to continue on that trajectory. There's a great article by Grant Wiggins. We'll include that in the resources as well. And he talks a lot about effective feedback and what that looks like, and that it isn't evaluation or judgment of how somebody did on a task or in a situation. It's not advice, though advice can be included after the feedback. And it's not praise, though that can be helpful in certain circumstances in building awareness of how one is being successful and what they did to be successful. So feedback is really an observation that's tied to a goal. So for example, when you put it that way and speak in a softer tone of voice, it makes me feel better. The first few paragraphs kept my full attention. The scene was painted with vivid interest, but the dialogue became hard for me to follow as a reader, so I was confused. Or a baseball coach. Each time you swung and missed, you raised your head as you swung, so you really didn't have your eye on the ball. On the one you hit hard, your head was down and you saw the ball. So again, it's more about observing what happened rather than making a judgment. So with these examples, also the receiver of the feedback has a clear understanding of what they should do next. So for our children, this might need to be discussed explicitly and reflectively, prompting them with questions. Given my feedback, do you have any ideas on how I can get closer to that goal, to your goal? But the reflection part of it is really about adding structure to reflection, not expecting them to be able to just do that piece of it, but initiating a conversation. What do you think worked well, or what didn't? And helping them understand why the skill, especially of self-regulation, is important. And then finally, explicit praise. So when praise is not explicit, researchers are finding that it can actually reduce motivation, and rewards can have the same impact. So current research is finding that students with learning disabilities develop intrinsic motivation as a result of improved skills and experienced success. So it's important to kind of call that success out, bring that awareness up of them being successful, and explicitly saying how they were successful, what you noticed, and then improved skills. So that competency piece is key as well. There's a latency effect to this, so it doesn't happen immediately after the explicit praise. But I do want to point out that extrinsic motivation, like rewards and things like that, they can seem to work in the short term and the immediate, but in the long term, it doesn't help build self-regulation or resilience or motivation. So explicit praise, or labeled praise as sometimes it's called, it really talks about what they did. So fantastic job waiting for your turn to speak rather than just great job. So you need to label the behavior you're looking for, letting them know you appreciate it, and then helping them feel good about it, letting them know what exactly they're being praised for, so that they'll more likely do it again. And I think that's it. So any questions? Feel free, you can turn your video on if you'd like, unmute yourself. I will
I think there's a question on chat. Let me check.
I know some people asked about the app. We can include a link in there in the resources too. Yeah, it seems like many of the strategies. Amber, you might want to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I'm trying to get. Okay.
Seems like many of the strategies are ones that work with ADHD. Yes. So when choosing what strategy to employ, how do we know if the behavior is driven by ADHD or dyslexia, or does it matter because strategies can work for both? So the tying factor is the working memory piece of it. Working memory and executive functioning. Without those skills, it's going to be hard to self-regulate. And so you're targeting executive self-regulation is a piece of executive functioning. And that is where our students with ADHD struggle. And students with ADHD often have vulnerable, if not weak, working memory skills as well. So it's the same, it's a tying factor for kids with ADHD, executive functioning, process dysfunction, as well as students with dyslexia. It's that working memory and executive functioning piece that ties it together. And that's why it looks similar. But it's really about choosing the right strategy is really about figuring out what they're struggling with, where are the challenges, what's the roadblock, what is making it hard for them to regulate. And it could just be developmental. It could be they're just not at that stage yet. You know, co-regulation is happening throughout adolescence. So it's a long process, and it's hard. It's hard for adults too sometimes. Are there any other questions?
So, if they are reluctant, if they do not cooperate, if they are defiant sometimes, you know, what do you suggest? You just let them be, ignore them, what, for a while?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. Depends on, is it impacting other children, or are you at home and it's just your child and you? I wouldn't completely ignore, but I would continually do breathing exercises or do some mindful movement. And then when you get through that, be a lot of work in the reflection piece of it, and then really diving into that those before strategies. So practicing mindful breathing.
So you work on yourself, sort of. You work on yourself to.
Yeah. Yeah, because when they're feeling dysregulated, they're not comfortable. There's something off. There's something wrong. And it's hard for a lot of students, especially who lack the foundational skills, to stop in that moment and pause. So that's what the adult is there for, to kind of model it. And eventually, you'll see. I mean, sometimes it takes time, but eventually they'll get there.
Thank you.
I have another question, if I may. And it's about one of your slides at the beginning. I missed the first bit, so I apologize if you already answered this question and I missed it because I couldn't connect in the beginning. You mentioned that between 2019 and 2022, you had higher reading rates in your school when compared to the rest of the US. Do you think this was solely because of your focus on SEL, or is it because you use a specific program, literacy program, that other schools don't? Or is it a mixture of both, maybe?
So what we found was that several of those 8 social and emotional learning skills, the qualities of a sustainable and independent learner, things like resilience, self-regulation, were predictors of these increases in numerical operations, word reading, those types of academic achievement. So we didn't put that on that slide because it's kind of hard to explain it. I didn't want to get too nerdy on it. But yes, so it's one of the reasons why we're seeing that increase. But I'm sure there's plenty of other reasons why our kids improved. How supportive the teachers are. We have excellent teachers. The professional development we do with our teachers. There's probably many other variables that are contributing to that improvement in reading and math as compared to the rest of the US. But we do know that part of the reason was a big explainer of these effects was the social emotional learning we teach in the classroom.
Thank you.
I mean, I think a piece of it too was because we have the Innovation Lab, we were able to start working with our teachers and our students months before everything shut down. So the students were trained to attend class on the computer, and the teachers
from before, sort of.
Yeah, the teachers were familiar with the technology. We did research on which programs, tech programs worked best, and most evidence-based virtual practices. So we were able to do all that research and apply it and practice it before everybody shut down. So that was definitely a factor, but we still see these improvements when we're not virtual. So even though I think that helped during the pandemic, I agree with Amber that the majority of the reason is that social emotional piece.
Okay, and I know that there's a bit of an issue with literacy at the moment in the US. So this is very interesting for me. It definitely should be adopted everywhere in the US. If you're seeing such great improvements, it's fantastic. Do you use a specific literacy program that you're following at the school, or is it a general one?
We use Orton Gillingham, Wilson.
That's brilliant. Okay.
Really a combination. Sometimes, oftentimes, because our learners are very complex, you can't just take a program off the shelf.
No, of course, you have to be able to adapt accordingly, of course.
Yeah.
But you do have a structured program that you follow.
Yeah.
That's really good. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, are there any more questions? No, it seems. So, are we perhaps ready to close?
Yep.
Thank you very much, Michele and Amber. It was really interesting. I'm sure that everybody found it interesting. And probably later on, we will come up with questions as you continue thinking about it. Thanks a lot. Thanks again. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, and everybody is welcome to reach out. We realize, like Carmen said, it takes time to process all of that information. And you might come up with questions later on. So feel free to email us. We'll share the resources like we mentioned. We'll share the recording too if you want to rewatch. And our emails, like I said, will be on there. So any further questions or you want some more recommendations, feel free to reach out. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.